I'm going to call the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Rural Development, FDA, and related agencies to order. Good morning and welcome to the second budget hearing for this subcommittee for fiscal year 2023. Secretary Vilsack, welcome back and thank you for joining us. And Mr. Rapp, we welcome you here too. We're glad to have both of you here today. The Department of Agriculture's vast mission includes ensuring the health and care of our nation's land, plants, and animals, as well as improving the quality of life and economies in rural America. The department serves Americans at the county, state, and national level, with even more locations overseas. We are grateful for the work of the USDA employees that support our farmers and ranchers at home and abroad. The fiscal year 2023 budget request for USDA is ambitious, and I am pleased that this request continues investment in climate resilience as well as support for our rural economies. It also includes funds to ensure that socially and geographically disadvantaged farmers and ranchers are able to access the services and opportunities that are essential to their success. I look forward to discussing these initiatives among the many others included in your budget request. I am also pleased the budget continues to invest in programs that support our rural communities, the backbone of this country. Rural development includes significant increases from broadband to housing to water and wastewater infrastructure. As inflation drives up home ownership opportunities and rental prices, it is essential that we ensure rural Americans have access to affordable housing. So I am pleased to see a number of proposed increases for rural housing programs. One issue that I know is important to both of us, Mr. Secretary, is ensuring USDA employees have the resources that they need to get the job done. We spoke last week about some of the staffing challenges that you face, and I hope that we can have a good discussion this morning about solving this problem and how this subcommittee can be helpful. This subcommittee has a long tradition of bipartisanship, and I look forward to working with our ranking member as we begin the process of drafting the fiscal year 2023 bill. Again, thank you for being here this morning. I look forward to your testimony. And as he has not yet arrived, I think we will recognize Ranking Member Hoeven as soon as he does appear. But why don't we begin right now with your testimony, and at the conclusion of that, we can recognize the Ranking Member.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning and appreciate the attention of the committee members as well. Let me start with a very important and I think significant statistic about the ag appropriations process. Non-defense discretionary spending over the last 8 or 9 years has grown by 27.4% across all departments, while the USDA's discretionary budget has grown but 14.3%, roughly half. And essentially what this has done is it's created some challenges with reference to the department, and I appreciate the Chair's commenting on 2 of the 3 that I'm going to discuss today. You mentioned the issue of staffing. Madam Chair, I will tell you this is a serious issue for us. When you look at our nutrition programs, we have seen a doubling of the amount of resources that goes through those programs, but we've seen the workforce at FNS be cut by 25%. When we talk about rural development, the department that basically is in the mission areas that is in charge of 3,142 rural counties across the United States, 15% of America's population, roughly 75% of America's land mass, deals with $30 to $40 billion in loans and grants each and every year, oversees a significant portion of the $230 billion loan portfolio that we have at USDA, but it's short about 500 workers. When we take a look at the backroom operations of USDA, the departmental administration, we've seen a nearly doubling of procurement responsibilities in that department, but the workforce has been cut by 43%. So I think it's essential and necessary for us to talk about the staffing levels at USDA. I think it's also necessary for us to talk about research. While healthcare research has understandably grown significantly by as much as 400% over the last decade, research in the ag area has flatlined after you take inflation into consideration. At one point in time, it represented 4.3% of the overall non-defense research allocations and appropriations for the federal government. Today, it is 2.3%. So it's been literally cut in half. This despite the fact that for every dollar we invest in agricultural research, there's a return of investment of $17. And I would say that most would say that's a pretty good return on investment. So our hope would be that as we talk about the budget, we focus on the important role of agricultural research. And you mentioned rural housing. That is also a challenge. We appreciate the additional support and help that this committee has provided in this space, but the reality is that we continue to struggle to maintain adequate housing. And we're going to see over time a significant reduction in the number of units as loans are paid off. Essentially what happens is those units convert from being subsidized to being available at market rates. So we're encouraging this committee to take a look at ways in which we could decouple the interest rates and the mortgage and the loan from the subsidization so that we would continue to be able to provide additional units, and also investing in the rehab of existing units so that the housing is not only available but also decent. In the time that I have remaining, Madam Chair, let me talk about something that's really of concern to me that is a bit outside the purview of this particular department, but it's of this budget committee, but it's something that I think we all ought to be concerned about. There are 61,670 farm families in America today that are on the brink. 61,670 farm families that are either delinquent in their loans to USDA, are bankrupt, or are pending foreclosure. This is a serious issue and I'm pretty confident that every single member of this committee probably has a number of those 61,000 farmers living in their states. It's important and necessary for us to put a spotlight on the challenges. Now, these are people who have borrowed from USDA or who have had a guaranteed loan from USDA, which means that they haven't been able on their own to go to a commercial bank and be able to secure financing. So these are folks who need help. They need assistance. I represented farmers during the 1980s as a small-town lawyer. I can tell you the pain. I can tell you the stress. I can tell you the decisions that folks make under these circumstances. I can tell you very tragic decisions that they make under these circumstances. So I would hope that as we talk about the future of agriculture in this country, that we don't lose sight of those 61,670 farm families. They deserve our attention. They deserve some creative thought about how we may be able to assist them during this pandemic-stricken time. And I sincerely hope that we can work collaboratively together in a bipartisan way to make sure that they have a hopeful future as opposed to one that is currently stress-filled today. I see the ranking members here, and so I'm going to stop talking.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary, for joining us today. Good to see you. Appreciate our conversation earlier, and of course, your testimony today. Welcome back in front of the committee. Heard you say before that the Department of Ag touches the lives of all Americans every day and in every way, and that's certainly true. Probably more true now than ever. Really, current events highlight the importance of our food supply and the importance of what our farmers and ranchers do for our country every single day. Food security is national security, and our farmers provide the lowest cost, highest quality food supply in the world. Right now, of course, we're struggling with inflation. We see it obviously for our farmers and ranchers. We see it for consumers across the board. We see it in the prices that people pay at the grocery store. We see it at the pump. Today, gasoline hit a record price average across the country of about $4.30 40 cents a gallon, right in that range. And so we've got to find ways to produce more energy in this country, to find ways to address the supply chain issues and the other challenges that are creating inflation. And our farmers are a big part of that. They're seeing it in the price that they pay, not only for fuel for their tractor and other equipment that they have to run every year to plant a crop and harvest a crop, but also obviously in fertilizer and their other inputs. And so it's very important that we do everything we can in terms of the Department of Agriculture and as well as in the energy patch to address these issues. And I know that you're working hard on it. We need to continue to do that. And of course, we're making significant investments here in this Ag Appropriations Committee to make sure that you're able to do that on behalf of our farmers. Just in recent years, in fiscal 22, USDA programs actually received an increase of 6.2% over the FY21 levels, and that included funding increase of 6.5% for research, which has been amazing in terms of what it's done for our farmers and ranchers and their ability to raise crops and animals across this nation. I've seen it in my own state. I know you've seen it in yours. It is truly, truly remarkable. Also, the resources for the FSA are incredibly important too, to help get our farmers through drought, through floods, through tough weather, tough prices, and in some cases, trade agreements that aren't fair. The FSA has a major role to play in keeping our farmers going. I want to be sure that our commitment to support rural America is as strong as ever. I know you share that. I know you've got some ideas on how to do that. We do too. We'll talk about those this morning. Also, I want to make sure that the funding that we have put in place for things like the Livestock Emergency Relief Program, WIP Plus for our farmers, that those funds get out to our farmers. You and I have talked about that. We'll talk about it some more today. And I know you're coming up with some ideas to expedite that. I appreciate that and look forward to working with you on it. Thanks again for being here today. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We're going to now begin rounds of 5-minute questions, and I will begin. Mr. Secretary, rural America has historically lagged behind urban regions in educational attainment, poverty levels, and overall well-being. And data shows that rural America has recovered from the Great Recession at a slower pace than urban America, which also has major implications for rural America's ability to adapt to the current economic and inflationary trends. So I was excited to see USDA formally launch the Rural Partners Network, which we provided initial funding for in the fiscal year 2022 Appropriations Act. So, Secretary, can you provide an update on how the Rural Partners Network is being implemented and how it will target funding to distressed communities? Additionally, talk about the fiscal year 23 budget proposal of $39 million for this initiative, and what additional resources will these funds provide? And lastly, it's a 3-part question. What agencies at USDA and other departments play a role in implementation of this initiative?
Madam Chair, this is, I think, a pretty significant question you've asked. The Rural Partnership Network is really designed to provide intensive care and direction and focus on communities that have been persistently poor, communities that have had a poverty rate of in excess of 20% for more than 20 or 30 years. They require folks on the ground, living, working, raising their own families in these communities, and then helping community leaders and community building organizations access the variety of programs that are available. We've started this in 5 states, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Arizona. We have targeted communities within each of those 5 states. We are in the process of hiring staff today who will actually live in communities within those states that we've selected through a process, a data-driven process. Those individuals will begin to identify programs and challenges and projects that folks are interested in pursuing, and then they will work collaboratively with 13 federal agencies and three commissions who will have what are called rural desk officers in each of those agencies. So this is transportation, HHS, education, et cetera. Those rural desk officers will be responsible for working collaboratively with the folks on the ground in those 5 states, in those communities, to identify the programs and to short circuit, if you will, the process for applying for successfully resources. Our belief is that by providing this intensive care and by providing an all-of-government approach, we'll be in a position to provide a meaningful progress that folks will be able to see and that they will actually learn, if you will, how to participate in federal programs. And they'll see a federal government that is working collaboratively with state and local governments to make life better. Our goal and hope is that we are able to expand this program significantly, which is why we've asked for an additional $39 million. This is going to essentially pay for individuals who will be living in those communities and working in those communities, as well as state directors overseeing those operations. It will also provide additional training. We know that there is a significant amount of training that's required for community leaders to understand the processes that they have to go through in applying for various grants. So these resources will allow us to expand the program. We've designated an additional 5 states, hopefully, to be able to select by the end of this year, this fiscal year. And with this additional resources, we would be able to significantly expand this effort across the United States in places where we just have had poverty that just hasn't gone away.
Thank you. Have you identified the 5 additional states, or are you still in the process of that data collection effort?
We have identified those 5 additional states. And I'm sorry, I know a few of them, but I can't tell.
You could follow up with.
Actually, I think Wisconsin happens to be one of them. North Carolina happens to be one of them. And I can't. I'm sorry, I can't remember the other.
Please just follow up afterwards. That's totally fine. Next, I'm going to recognize Senator Hoeven for your first round of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, at the end of September, we authorized funding both for WIP Plus and for livestock assistance. That was about $10 billion, $750 million for what you now refer to as the Emergency Livestock Relief Program, and then 9.23 billion that is actually available for WIP Plus. We've talked about both, not only with you, but with Zach Ducheneau. We appreciate the working relationship. The Emergency Livestock Relief Assistance is out there for the livestock producers, about $560 million of it. The remaining part I know you're working on. We'll work with you on that. We appreciate that. That's underway. But I want to ask you about WIP Plus. Where are we with WIP Plus and getting it out to our farmers?
Appreciate the support from Congress, Senator. We are in the process of finalizing the work that will allow us to pre-fill the application that will be required for farmers to benefit from the WIP Plus program. In the past, there were roughly 250 questions that would be asked of a farmer to be answered to be able to apply for WIP funding. We're going to pre-fill that application, so at the end of the day, there will be just a handful of boxes that have to be checked and signed. Our hope and belief is that within the next couple of weeks, we announce the structure and the framework for how you go about applying for these resources so that payments can potentially start in June.
Yeah, and what you've explained to me, and I appreciate, is that it's taken longer on the front end to get it set, but that once you announce it, it'll be quicker to get it out, correct?
Correct. And we're going to do this in 2 tranches. You mentioned the livestock situation. $560 million has been provided. The additional resources will be provided in a second tranche for those the folks that weren't covered by a livestock forage program, or they had shallow losses, or they had a loss that wasn't quite covered by some of those programs.
Right.
What we've done is we've taken the information and data from those programs, like crop insurance, like the NAP program, and we pre-filled these applications for the grain folks. There may be people that will be left out in that process as well, so there'll be a smaller second round of funding after the June payments.
And once it's out, we'd like you to have somebody get out there with us and talk to the livestock groups, or in this case, the commodity groups, the farm groups, so we can explain it, if that's something that you would work with us to do.
Absolutely. And our state folks will continue to do this at a state level. Our state directors, that's part of their responsibility to make sure people understand.
And we want to join with them in doing that so we can explain it to producers. Livestock Indemnity Program, again, we appreciate that. We've had blizzards, we've had some calf mortality, not only in our state but other places. So the Livestock Indemnity Program, very important this year. One of the things we talked about, and that is for calves under 250 pounds, which is typically where you have a lot of the mortality in these spring blizzards. That payment rate for 22 really is not reflective of the cost of those animals. And I've asked if you would work on adjustment there. And then also making sure that for animals that get sick because of that weather, they may not die right away, but they get anthrax, pneumonia, or something else, and then they die later, that they are, that the Livestock Indemnity Program applies to those animals. So would you address those two things under that program?
We're focusing on those two plus the issue of timeliness. So those are three issues that we're taking a look at. The payment rate is obviously a challenging one because it's essentially we've tried to marry the livestock program to what we do on the crop side, where essentially we take a look at a lesson market weight as being almost like a freshly sown crop, and comparing it and contrasting it to that. We're in the process of taking a look at this because you've raised the issue about what has happened in North Dakota, and we're taking a look at this. We're also taking a look at the cause of loss, recognizing, as you point out, that it could be delayed. There may be a problem that occurs initially during a blizzard, whatever, but it doesn't surface until many, many months later, and we recognize and appreciate that may have an impact on value. So both of those issues are being looked at by the team, and we're also trying to figure out ways in which we could potentially provide for more annual production information as we do with crops, which might make it easier for us to have a better understanding of how to value livestock at various times depending upon the disaster and depending upon the weight. As it is now, we have to basically collect this data on a disaster-by-disaster basis, and that's problematic.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but it's particularly that one category. So we're not saying across all categories. We're saying in that category of 250 pounds and less. So that's what we want you to take a look at, and I know you understand that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hoeven. I understand there's a special birthday today. Happy birthday, Senator Hyde-Smith.
Is this where we sing or not?
No, I think
Open
that
to
would ruin her birthday.
And next, it doesn't put you up in the queue, though. Sorry about that. So, Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Chair. I had wished the Senator a happy birthday earlier, and I said I'm glad to see these young people here insofar as everybody is in the Senate. Secretary, it's great to see you, and I appreciate all the times we've been able to chat. And, Ms. Wojciechowski, good to see you. And Secretary, I want to discuss a new initiative. I worked with Senators Baldwin and Hoeven, Shelby, to put in the fiscal year 2022 spending bill for the department. The new investment for the department helped establish institutes of rural partnerships, whether when Tropical Storm Irene tore through Vermont, devastating, isolating so many communities, or challenges brought out around the country with COVID-19. Vermont's trying to find new ways to collaboratively tackle these problems. The Institutes for Rural Partnerships to the USDA can help rural America plan for future challenges. That's a priority of this committee. They can forge connections between public and private entities across every level of government, and I think they're extremely important. You, probably more than any secretary, understand rural America. When do you anticipate the department is going to move forward with this initiative? How will USDA partner with these institutes to promulgate best practices that can be used in rural areas?
Senator, our National Institute of Food and Agriculture is our lead agency on this. They are in the process of working with staff to make sure that we are structuring this program in a way that is consistent with congressional intent and the feedback that we've recently received about how these institutes should be set up. I foresee that they'll work closely and collaboratively with mission areas like the Economic Research Service, ERS, to collect data and information. I'm sure that they'll work closely with rural development to make sure that we know what kind of programs. As I've shared with the chair, we have the Rural Partnership Network. I would imagine that institutes will be quite interested in studying the impact and effect of those partnerships. They will obviously continue to work with the research aspect of USDA. So I think there's great possibilities and potential. The challenge, I think, for us is to make sure we know exactly what it is you want us to do, because it could be an incredibly broad array of things we could do. But that's the reason why we're spending a little time listening. But I would anticipate and expect that we're going to get this thing going before the end of the fiscal year.
And one thing I'm sure you're hearing from everybody because of COVID, the food insecurity in our country. I know our food banks in Vermont are feeling this. That could probably be said about every state. Schools are now facing the expiration of USDA child nutrition waivers, allowed them to expand, especially during the summer months. I'm pleased to see the administration propose increased funding for TFAP, a vital source of fund for food banks, which I support. There's another area, I know again, being too parochial, Vermont's been a leader in growing local and organic food, but it's very difficult to get that included in federal nutrition programs such as TFAP. Can we find ways to get federal dollars more involved in this?
Senator, we established a local and regional food aspect of TFAP this year, in which we're asking state agencies to work with us to provide, and we're providing roughly $600 million as an initial effort, so that food banks would be able to access locally grown and raised foods that could include organic. So the state of Vermont, for example, could encourage that for both the food banks as well as for the school meal program. And what we want to be able to do is create a stronger local and regional food system to complement our commodity production agriculture so that we have a more resilient food system. So that's in the works.
Good. And we'll work with you any way we can. I just want to thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know the final spending package for fiscal year 2022 saw responsible and I believe very transparent return of congressionally directed spending. I want to applaud this subcommittee for the way they worked across the aisle. I know you're working with us on that, and I think you'll find broad bipartisan support to get it done. So I thank you, and I thank you, Chair.
Senator Collins.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Prior to your confirmation, we had an in-depth conversation that led to my decision to vote for your confirmation. We discussed two issues in particular, and I'm going to follow up on those two issues today and express my disappointment. The first is the issue of PFAS, those forever chemicals, contamination. Maine is in the forefront of efforts to address contamination on our farms from PFAS. I told you that in 2016, a dairy farmer in Arundel, Maine, had discovered that the milk that was being produced by his cattle contained some of the highest levels ever reported from a PFAS contaminant. Since that time, these forever chemicals have been found in feed, in soil, in water, in crops, in livestock, on farms all across Maine. So This is obviously devastating for these farmers and their livelihoods and their families. They're facing extreme financial hardship, and we've learned that the USDA's Dairy Indemnity Payment Program only covers fluid milk, so it does not begin to cover all of the problems for these dairy farmers in particular. In October of last year, I sent you a letter and asked you to provide me with an update on what USDA could do to assist these farmers. I received no response. Then in March, I again sent you a letter that was signed by all the members of Maine's delegation, requesting that USDA use all of its existing authorities and programs to provide assistance. Mr. Secretary, we received a response to that letter at 1:24 a.m. this morning. We never received a response to my October letter, and the letter to you that we sent in March, we got the response literally at 1:24 a.m. this morning. Putting that aside, will you work with us, and I mean really work with us, to identify programs that you either have now or that we could ask to be modified so that we can assist these affected farmers?
Senator, I'm surprised by your question, and the reason I am is because I'm under the impression that we, in fact, are providing indemnity for livestock as opposed to fluid milk. Recognize we started this process with just basically paying for the milk that was damaged, and realized that was not adequate, and so we are in the process. I think we've done this. Begin paying farmers for the loss of livestock. So I think we want to check on that. But so we have taken action. Certainly apologize for not answering letters. I can tell you that the young lady behind me can attest to the fact that I have put a concerted effort to try to get to a response to congressional inquiries. I'm embarrassed by this, and I apologize for it. We're going to try to do better on the correspondence side, which is why you got the response at 1:48 this morning. Better late than never, but certainly not responsible as it should be. The PFAS issue, let me explain to you what I think we need to do. We're working with EPA to try to establish a national standard on what is an acceptable level or not of PFAS, and the reason for this is so that we can basically help to define the level of assistance and help that's required. You're absolutely right. This is pervasive. It's not just in Maine. It's everywhere because basically sludge was used to fertilize farm fields for many, many, many years without an understanding and appreciation of the challenge. So I would say two things. One, happy to work with you. Happy to work with the EPA to set a national standard. Happy to work with this committee or whatever committee to establish an amount of resources that would help deal with this issue. It's going to be a large amount. And then I would certainly say we need to make sure we continue to fund research because I think we're going to continue to find some challenges with reference to things that we've done for years and years and years that are now cropping up as being problems.
Thank you. I look forward to our second round.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, last week, President Biden announced a major disaster declaration in New Mexico as a result of multiple severe wildfires, including one that was initiated by a U.S. Forest Service prescribed fire that simply escaped control. I want to make sure that the USDA is fully prepared to assist affected communities mitigate potential flood damages before this year's upcoming monsoon season, which starts typically in early July. The Emergency Watershed Protection Program is going to be really essential in that recovery. The village of Ruidoso, which was the subject to a wildfire that caused several fatalities, destroyed over 200 homes, they've already requested EWP assistance, and I'm expecting that a number of communities in northern New Mexico may do so soon. My concern is really that the NRCS office in New Mexico has just never had to deal with this quantity of EWP assistance before and may need additional personnel or other resources to be able to conduct those assessments and implement some recovery on the ground before we get hit by those big thunderstorms. So just given the severity of the fire's destruction and the upcoming monsoon season, I want to ask that you would work with NRCS to make sure that they can meet that urgent need.
Happy to do it, and we are adding additional personnel, Senator, across NRCS to try to beef up significantly the capacities at the state level.
That's great news. One of the other areas that I think is going to be important from the same sort of perspective is like EWP, other disaster programs within Farm Service Agency. For example, the Livestock Indemnity program is going to be another one of those places where it's just not set up for the scale of the demand that we're going to see in the immediate after effects of these fires. And so I would also just ask that you look closely at FSA and make sure that they're able to get on the ground and really meet people in these communities and get them to understand what they need to do to access those sorts of programs.
We will certainly do that, and if it turns out that the staffing is not adequate, there are surge teams that we can put in place. We unfortunately and tragically have had far too much experience with this issues, not just in New Mexico, but in many other western states, so we understand and appreciate what we have to do.
No, I appreciate that. One of the related issues I want to raise for you, and it actually goes back to when you were talking about the Rural Partners Network, many of the communities affected by these particular wildfires are really under-resourced, persistently poor, as I believe you described it. And because of the significant need for assistance in those communities, the New Mexico delegation actually requested that President Biden waive the federal cost share for FEMA assistance. I'd like to be able to work with you to look at the appropriate cost share for USDA disaster programs, simply because these are the exact same communities that on the New Mexico list that you referenced before, that were barely getting by before they were just devastated by these fires. So would like to be able to work with you to develop some guidelines for what might be an appropriate cost share in this case.
Oh, that's an appropriate request, and to the extent that we have the capacity through our regulations and statutes to do so, we'll be happy to work with you.
Great. To shift gears for a second, on last year's agriculture appropriations bill, this subcommittee encouraged USDA to conduct demonstration programs on dual-use renewable energy systems. These are otherwise known as agrivoltaics. I wanted to ask, does USDA have enough funding for the renewable energy infrastructure and the research expertise to really conduct some of these demonstration programs that we've looked at through this committee?
Well, I think it has the expertise. I don't know that we necessarily have the resources. It's just why part of what would be involved here would be NIFA, our National Institute of Food and Agriculture, as well as our ARS facilities. And I'm frank to say we think that we need more resources in those areas across the board, not just in this area, but in terms of staffing, in terms of facilities, and in terms of the capacity to do more work with land-grant universities.
Madam Chair, I hope the committee will look at this. We've had a number of places around the country where there has been a direct conflict between taking land out of production to do renewable projects, and we've seen great success in a few places where they've actually been able to effectively produce energy and farm on the same footprint and increase the income for the farmer as a result. And I think it has a lot of promise.
Next, Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Chairwoman Baldwin, and thank you, Secretary Vilsack and Mr. Rapp, for being here today and your willingness to serve and participate. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, assists state and local bodies with flood mitigation and water quality improvements, erosion control, and several things related to that through the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, which is really important to a state like Mississippi. Like many rural communities and landowners across the country, Mississippi and its people have been hit particularly hard in recent years by excessive rainfall, flooding, and other problems caused by natural disasters. The Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program has been invaluable in allowing small towns to recover from these events and, importantly, to prepare for the next one, because we know the next one will be coming as well. In early June 2021, many parts of Mississippi experienced just unprecedented rainfall, some receiving more than 12 inches of rain in less than 12 hours. My office was getting phone calls all day and videos during that time. And as you might expect, it caused severe flooding and the roads and bridges and failures of dams and levees and everything that such an event as that would cause. And thousands of Mississippians were affected and millions in damages occurred. Fortunately, we have programs like Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations administered by NRCS. But because of the problems and similar problems I've mentioned, I requested $8.4 million in watershed operations funds in the FY 2022 Agriculture Appropriations Bill for NRCS Mississippi to help address some of our challenges. Funds were used to support nearly 10 or more projects across 9 Mississippi counties. That provision became law with the enactment of the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2022, and I thank Chair Baldwin and Ranking Member Hoven for supporting my request throughout that conference process. But I, along with my staff and many constituents, we have a great respect and don't know what we would do without NRCS, and we appreciate the many services that they provide. But, Mr. Secretary, what is the status of the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations funding provided in that FY 2022 Omnibus? And I'm looking for some feel-good news that it's, being put to very good use. But please share any updates that you may have as to how the funds provided by NRCS in Mississippi are or will soon be utilized to help rural communities and landowners addressing flood, water, and these issues that I've just articulated.
With specifically the $8.4 million, the NRCS folks are working with the local sponsors of the projects that were identified to basically work through the implementation plan, so that process is in place. In addition, the state of Mississippi was the recipient of $47.8 million of additional resources under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Of the $500 million that was allocated under that law for watershed and flood prevention operations, Mississippi receiving $47.8 million of additional resources. So NRCS is working on a variety of projects in Mississippi. My staff will be able to give you the list of the projects that were identified in that $47.8 million. We are working on, for example, a big project with Madison County on a stream bank erosion issue. We know that a lot of the sediment issues in Mississippi are not a result of you're losing your topsoil. It's a result of the banks basically eroding and over time creating some challenges. And so I think you're going to see significant activity in this space in the Mississippi because of the money and resources that have been provided through the appropriations process and through the infrastructure law.
Wonderful. Appreciate that answer. And I've got a few seconds left. Rural communities across the U.S., we will always be faced with these weather-related challenges, and I was pleased that the FY 2023 budget request for USDA included the WFPO funding in it as well. Should Congress provide funding to address project or watershed-specific challenges through the WFPO in FY 23, how confident are you that the NRCS can put those funds to good use?
Well, I'm confident they can, as long as we continue to increase the staffing levels. I think the key here is not just increasing the resources, but making sure that you've got the staff on the ground that can implement these resources in a proper way.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. I just want to say you have a very tough job to start with. My understanding is that the West has become a real problem for fire. Since 2017, wildfire has burned 10 million acres in my state, California, killed nearly 200 people, and destroyed more than 32,000 homes. Even as we speak, I understand that large wildfires are burning in New Mexico and Arizona. So what do? The agencies have been chronically understaffed. Many federal wildland fighters are moving to state jobs, particularly in my state, because the pay is better. So, Mr. Secretary, I want to know what you think would help most. Is it that rise in pay? What is it? Because we've got to hire enough people to handle what's going to happen with global warming. And that particularly goes for my state, and I'm very concerned.
Senator, thanks for the question. I think it is important for us to do three things. One, transition some of our part-time people to full-time status, which would provide them additional pay and benefits. And we are doing that. We are literally transitioning hundreds of firefighters. Two, a new classification system for wildland firefighter. We are in the process, as directed by Congress and the President, we are in the process of working with the Department of Interior and the Office of Personnel Management to develop a new classification that will create a more competitive salary scale for wildfighters. And then three, we're going to continue to implement the additional resources that were provided under the infrastructure law to provide additional pay this year that will allow us to be able to do a better job of recruiting and retaining our workforce. So those three things are in the process of being done, and I think you're going to see more firefighters on the ground, which is going to be absolutely necessary because we're not going to see an abatement of these wildfires for some time.
Well, in your recently released 10-year strategy to address this crisis, you indicated your focus would be on communities most at risk, and this is especially important for more rural communities in California at the wildland-urban interface. It's my understanding that your fireshed map identified that many at-risk communities in California are not near federal lands, which means they won't be eligible for most Forest Service funding for wildfire mitigation. How is the department going to help rural communities, especially those not adjacent to federal land, to reduce their risk and become more resilient?
Well, your support and the support of others in the Senate for the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law is a response to that question, because $1.5 billion of the resources that you allocated for the Forest Service will be provided to state and local communities for that very purpose, giving them the resources to be able to work collaboratively with us. It is a collaboration, Senator. The fact that it may not be on a particular map doesn't mean that we won't work with those local communities, provide technical assistance, direction, and assistance. We do that all the time. But now we have the resources, and we can give those local and states resources to be able to provide more community preparedness, more training, more support for their volunteer fire departments, et cetera. So that $1.5 billion is incredibly important.
Well, you certainly have my support. And I want to say, I think, for the largest state in the union, my concern about fire in the last 10 years has just gone straight up. I see these fires, and I see what can happen. And I really don't know what we can do to give you the resources to put up the ability to stop big, massive fire in our state.
Well, the 10-year fire mitigation strategy is designed to do that, and certainly the bipartisan infrastructure law was a start in terms of the financial resources necessary, but committees are going to have to continue to provide that support over the next decade for us to see a significant reduction in the risk, because we have hundreds of millions of acres of dead trees as a result of pine bark beetle and climate. We've got a substantial amount of hazardous fuel buildup that has to be addressed. It's going to require resources. We've got them for the next couple of years. The key will be to continue that effort over a 10-year period.
Well, let me ask this. I would be most interested in helping with a plan, if you have one, to see that we can provide what we need to provide. I'm really very worried because California is extraordinarily dry and fire is a real enemy.
We'll absolutely work with you, Senator.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks, Madam Chairman.
Senator Blunt, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, great to see you. And I think every appearance may be some kind of record because of your long service in this job. And I'm grateful that you've done that and continue to be willing to do it. You and I have talked about this before. I was a supporter of relocating the headquarters of ERS and NEFA to another location that turned out to be in Kansas City, and of course I was even more pleased with that. There was a report issued that by GAO that stated that the previous administration's decision to relocate those agencies was not fully consistent with the evidence, with an evidence-based approach. You then pointed out, or the department pointed out, that the GAO used metrics established after the relocation and that was not exactly a fair analysis of what they would have been looking at the time. I've been to that location recently. They're about to really come alive, frankly, for the first time. A great space, but highly underutilized because people have been working from home. I'm wondering, based on your previous role and the perspective you would have, if you've seen yet a way that this move alters operations or applications. I think that locations with 3-hour car drive from 8 different land-grant universities, which we thought was one of the principal advantages you might have in the future. But have you seen any difference yet in operations there, or what have you seen in terms of filling job vacancies in that location?
Senator, we have a goal of about 750 people between the ERS facility and the NIFA mission area. We're about 650. We've seen about 450 folks who have been hired in those 2 mission areas. So the hiring has been, I think, robust. I think people are anxious and interested in working in that environment. You know, we got some great people who work over there, and they churn out the work regardless of pandemics, regardless of whatever the challenges may be. We had a morale issue, which we're dealing with, and I think as we hire more folks, that issue, it becomes less of an issue. The work is getting done, and it's getting done on time. You know, the reality is that those agencies have great working relationships with land-grant universities and minority-serving institutions all across America. You know, I think I would say that as we look at this concept, the challenge, I think, is to do it in a way that provides less disruption than the way it was handled before. And I think there are ways to do that. And I think this is, you know, I think we're going to see a lot of good work coming out of that facility. I have no doubt about that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think for lots of reasons, cost of living and other things, there are reasons to look at other locations now as we think about expanding here or moving somewhere else. And I appreciate your sense that what the impact on the current workforce and how you maybe transition is important there. You know, those agencies, among others, really looking carefully at world food need right now and what happens as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. What concerns do you have? And what should the department do? Should we make more American acreage available in some foreseeable window that might not be available otherwise? Or should we step back from taking more acres offline as we try to figure out what happens with this great food-producing part of the world being so impacted, in Africa and other places that have benefited from that raw unprocessed food stuff being impacted?
Senator, I'm traveling to Germany tomorrow and then to Poland in order to get a firsthand look at the situation in Ukraine. We have a twin challenge here. we've got an immediate global food security challenge by virtue of the disruption that the invasion has caused and the impact it's going to have on potentially unstable conditions in the Middle East and North Africa because of food shortages. So we need to address that, and that's one of the reasons why we tapped the Bill Emerson Trust. Part of the challenge there isn't just tapping the trust, but making sure that it's replenished, which I think is important, and the supplemental appropriations bill that you're considering would begin that process. The other challenge with that trust is the transportation cost. It's amazing to me that it costs more than the value of the product we're transporting to get that food to Ethiopia and some of the North African countries. So I think there is an opportunity for us to look at ways in which that could potentially be addressed. I would say with the second challenge we have is the issue of climate, because that's going to impact our long-term capacity to meet global food needs. And I'm really, really excited about the reaction to the Climate Smart and Forestry Product Partnership Initiative. We got 450 applications from 350 organizations and groups, commodity groups, nonprofits, for-profit organizations, all 50 states, probably 3 to 4 times the $1 billion that we put on the table. So there's tremendous interest in doing that as well. So I think what we have to do is figure out ways in which we can do both. And one thing we could do is look for ways, creative ways to help double cropping opportunities, expand the number of counties that are insured, figure out other administrative ways to make it easier for farmers, reducing the risk of double cropping.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I have maybe other questions either for the record or for a second round if there is one.
Well, we're starting it right now, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions in the second round. Mr. Secretary, I want to talk a little bit about climate-smart agriculture. Our farmers and ranchers, producers, experience firsthand the impacts of climate change, and I appreciate this administration's whole-of-government approach to combating the climate crisis, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture's efforts to conserve and protect our nation's natural resources while enhancing economic growth and creating new streams of income for our producers. Can you give the committee an update on the climate-smart agriculture activities of the department, and also what is the department doing to ensure that farmers, ranchers, and producers of all backgrounds are able to access the resources needed to strengthen their climate-smart agricultural practices?
There are 3 ways I'd like to respond to that question. First, there has been a significant effort on the part of NRCS to catalog and to characterize climate-smart practices and to provide information on 33 different activities that farmers and producers can take to be climate-smart, whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whether it's sequestering more carbon. And we're going to continue to do a better job of providing that information. NRCS has worked with a grant program with 118 different organizations that are connected to minority producers and socially disadvantaged producers, historically underserved producers, in an effort to try to make sure that those individuals who may in the past have had a hard time accessing that kind of information get that information. And that program is going to continue. That's something we feel very strongly about. That's in addition to the additional technical assistance efforts that underway under the American Rescue Plan. Under Section 1006, you provided resources to be able to expand. We currently have 20 larger community building organizations that are connected to minority producers that are also working to make sure that they have the full array of FSA and NRCS programs. Secondly, as I just mentioned to Senator Blunt, we're really excited about the response to the $1 billion that was put on the table to ask producers to put together pilot projects and demonstration projects. The fact that we got 450 applications from 350 different organizations and entities across all 50 states, even at the minimum, we're talking about $2.2 billion. I know some of those applications were for $50 million or more, so I'm pretty sure we're probably 3x or 4x to what we put on the table. So there's obviously tremendous interest there. And then finally, I think there is, again, a research component to this in which we are working with NIFA, working with ARS to provide the tools and the technologies and the capacity for farmers to have a better understanding of what climate smart actually means and be able to measure and quantify and verify it.
Thank you. I know we're on our second round of questions, but I'm going to interrupt the back and forth of Democrat and Republican to allow Senator Tester to ask his first round of questions.
Goodness, if I only knew what I was going to ask. I want to, first of all, thank you for being here, Secretary Vilsack. It's always good to see you, doing the Lord's work, making sure that family farmers and ranchers have a shot out there. And we all know that rural America has been declining, and it's going to continue to decline unless we do some things a little differently. And you know where I'm going with this. A few weeks back, the Senate Agricultural Committee, and I'm sure you're watching it, held a hearing on two bills that deal with consolidation in the marketplace when it comes to the cattle industry. You know the statistics. 4 companies control over 80% of the marketplace. Capitalism doesn't work in situations like that, and we want capitalism to work. We want there to be competition in the marketplace so that both cow-calf operators and consumers can reap the benefits of a good competitive system. The President's budget asked for $35 million for packers and stockyards. Given the issues that I just said, I just brought up beef, pork, poultry, and others are in a very similar situation. Do you think that level of funding is adequate, the $35 million for packers and stockyards?
It would represent a very significant increase, Senator, and I think it would be adequate for us as we strengthen packers and stockyards. This year, you'll see probably 3 rules coming out from the department in an effort to try to strengthen the enforcement capacity of the department, and those resources would be very important to being able to do that.
That's good, because it's going to be, I mean, you are the key to unlocking this, you, your department, and you. And so making sure you have the resources to deal with the situation in a fair way is really critically important. As I told you before, I'm not for putting anybody out of business. What I'm for is add more competition in the marketplace, and the Packers and Stockyards Act was originally set up to do that, and we just haven't had the enforcement capabilities. I don't need to tell you about a historically bad drought west of the Mississippi. Last year was the worst year I ever had. This is 44 years on the farm. Grandfather homesteaded at 110, and I think with the exception of 1919 and 1920 when they had to move back to the Red River Valley after they started homesteading because of drought. This may be the worst year since then. And by the way, where I happen to live in north central Montana, I was seeding last weekend in dry dirt. We don't get a rain, it's going to be worse than last year. We passed $10 billion in disaster relief last fall, including $750 million for livestock producers. This is critically life and death money. I mean, truthfully, nobody wants to get a check from the federal government, but the bottom line is the drought has caused hay prices to go through the roof. There has been no grass resource because there's been no water. There's been no crops raised because there's been no water. And so can the USDA, can you share any update on the progress of getting that $10 billion in disaster relief out the door?
Livestock producers have received checks in the amount of $560 million last month and this month. There will be a second round of funding for the livestock producers who weren't necessarily covered by the Livestock Forage Program or the Livestock Indemnity Program. We took information from those programs and basically pre-filled the application so that we could move the money out more quickly than in the past. In terms on the crop side, we anticipate and expect announcing this month the structure for how the crop reimbursements will take place. That will also involve pre-filled applications. There are roughly 250 questions that are asked of a producer in order to be able to access WIP Plus. Most of those questions will be pre-filled from crop insurance and NAP data, and we expect and anticipate checks will come out in June.
So doing some quick math in my head, there's about 190 million on the livestock side that is yet to be allocated.
It is because we want to make sure we cover those producers that didn't necessarily have, they may have had a shallow loss, they may have had a loss that didn't qualify for one of those programs. So therefore, there wouldn't have been the data or the information available to the department. So we will go through a process of having them apply for the resources.
And thank you for that. One really quick. I was talking to sitting in the airport last Thursday, and I was talking to a guy that said that he had received some money on cattle shipping to be able to move his cattle. Is that number one? I certainly don't have a problem with that, with the price of fuel and lack of trucks. Are you aware of that program? 'Cause that's not one I was aware of.
Well, we're providing it. We've expanded the Livestock Indemnity program, or I believe that's the Livestock Indemnity, or the forage program, to include additional assistance for transportation.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure whether it's the cattle or whether it's I think it's transporting the cattle to where there may be feed or
That's
grain.
correct.
Yeah,
That's exactly what
we've expanded the program to include reimbursement for that transportation expense.
I don't know whose idea what that was, but great idea. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, Senator Moran.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Secretary, hello. Seems like every conversation with the Secretary of Agriculture for as long as I've been in the Congress includes conversations about disaster. And I want to highlight a problem we have with the Emergency Livestock Relief Program. We've had drought and wildfires across our state, but most recently in December of 21, 160,000 acres across 13 counties in Kansas burned. Grassland, forage sorghum, and other feed sources that producers rely on to get through the winter. Since those fires occurred outside the, quote, normal grazing period, these producers are not eligible for LFP and therefore are not being helped by disaster assistance. USDA described in the announcement on March 1st as Phase 1. Will Phase 2 of the disaster assistance provide support to livestock producers who lost forage and grazing lands to wildfires outside normal grazing periods?
Senator, we are in the process of developing a list of those non-covered disasters, as the one you've just mentioned, to make sure we have a comprehensive list, and then from that list we're going to make a determination of how best to spend and invest the second tranche of resources. Certainly understand what you've outlined, and I will tell you that the concerns that you've expressed are on the list. They've been placed on the list. I want to make sure that I check with our folks to make sure that I'm right when I say we're going to consider this seriously. I don't know that we've necessarily made a decision yet about exactly who gets what, but I know that it's on the list.
If you would give me the chance to make the case it should be high on the list, I'd appreciate that.
Certainly.
Does USDA expect to need additional funding for ad hoc disaster assistance?
Well, I'm never going to ask a question where do you need additional resources. Here's the problem, Senator, and you've addressed it. Our disaster assistance programs are sort of a one-size-fits-all. And the reality is we're now learning that there are multiple types of disasters in multiple different areas involving multiple commodities and in multiple different ways. And it's going to be important and necessary for us, I think, to have enough flexibility and resources to be able to try to tailor the disaster assistance to the actual disaster as opposed to having a one-size-fits-all, and sometimes your folks don't fit in it, and that's unfortunate. More resources, but I would say in addition to more resources, let's make sure it's flexible enough to be able to use it for multiple disasters.
I always like that flexibility until it doesn't cover something that I think needs to be covered. And I appreciate the conversation, and perhaps you're leveraging me to suggest we need more disaster assistance, more dollars. Input costs, fertilizer prices. I've asked the subcommittee that I'm the lead Republican on has jurisdiction over the Department of Commerce. We are trying to do something about countervailing duties on phosphates from Morocco and to stop the implementation of duties on nitrogen fertilizer from Trinidad and Tobago. Can you help? Can you be an ally in any of this?
Well, we've certainly indicated a necessity of looking at those countervailing duties. In addition, as you know, we've announced an effort to try to put resources on the table to see what we could do here in the United States to produce more fertilizer. We're also working with producers on crop choice and conservation practices that could potentially reduce fertilizer use. We're also focusing on a split nitrogen policy for crop insurance that will basically cover crop losses if you decide to half your nitrogen application. I mean, there are a series of things we're doing. We're also working with state attorney generals to take a look at whether or not the fertilizer costs that are currently being paid by farmers are legitimate. It's a very interesting graph. If you take a look at the history of fertilizer and crop prices, as crop prices go up, so do fertilizer costs. Maybe there's no reason for that. But
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I don't understand the love affair with countervailing duties on components of fertilizer, and I'll continue my efforts, and I appreciate any help you can give. The supplemental double cropping issue, planting soybeans after winter wheat, just announced a week or so ago. I would remind you that sorghum is a major food crop for many African nations, and it's a crop that can be planted behind wheat in many parts of Kansas. Additionally, much of the world's sunflower oil comes from Ukraine, another crop that could be utilized in that fashion. Why does the administration's supplemental request only propose to incentivize soybean and not include other food crops like sorghum and sunflowers?
It was a conversation starter, and you're absolutely right. And there's no reason why we couldn't include those, and should.
And would that include the $10 per acre incentive for?
To the extent that there are incentives that we're looking at or flexibilities that we're looking at, we're going to try to be as comprehensive as we can be.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate your answers.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to go a little bit out of order. I know Senator Collins has a time schedule issue, so I'm going to call on you for your second round, then Senator Braun for your first round.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator Braun. Secretary Vilsack, you won't be surprised that the second issue that I'm going to bring up with you today concerns potatoes. Potatoes are an extremely nutritious vegetable. They contain more potassium than bananas. They are a good source of fiber, vitamin B6, vitamin C, and very important today to families that are struggling to buy groceries. They are affordable. During the Obama administration, and I won't relive this, but we went back and forth on whether potatoes should be restricted in the school lunch and school breakfast programs and the WIC programs, and they were not. When you appeared before the subcommittee last year, I questioned USDA's proposed elimination of funding for the highly successful potato breeding research program. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, not only rejected the elimination of that program, but rather than zeroing it out, actually increased it somewhat to $3 million a year. Given the strong congressional support, I was very surprised to see that your budget is again proposing to zero out this program, especially when the administration is seeking an overall increase of more than $2 billion in discretionary spending for USDA. The University of Maine is a leader in the research in this program and has worked with growers to develop a new variety named the Caribou Russet that is producing high yields and is much more disease resistant. And one need look no further than the recent outbreak of the potato wart in Prince Edward Island in Canada to understand the importance of continuing to invest in research that produces hardier crops and protects our domestic markets. So my question for you, given Congress's action last year, given what a small amount this is in the context of your entire budget, why are you again seeking to completely eliminate funding for the potato breeding research program, which has been proven successful in helping our growers prevent agricultural and economic losses?
Senator, I rely on the professionals at ARS to give me a list of their priorities. I think it goes back to my earlier comments about the importance of investing more money in research and investing more money in ARS. I mean, the reality is that these have been flatlined for an extended period of time, and when they're flatlined, you establish priorities. And obviously, if Congress basically directs us to maintain that program, we obviously will. But I would hope that it does so in the context of significantly increased resources for ARS, including resources to improve the facilities. Part of the challenge that we're now facing, we have 118 facility projects, roughly 30 of them are either fully or partially funded. That leaves quite a few that aren't. And so it's a matter of resources. But if we have more resources, we can do more work.
Well, I'm going to give you the chart that I always hand out on potatoes, and which you've received from me previously, but it doesn't make sense. You end up spending more money if you have to provide disaster assistance or other kinds of assistance than if you invest up front in the research that produces a more disease-resistant crop.
Well, Senator, that would be true if that was the only crop that we had to be concerned about and the only research project, but it's not. That's the problem. We have, as we've already discussed here today, a multitude of disasters and challenges, and that's the issue. If we have more resources, then we can obviously cover more research projects.
But potatoes do not receive crop support money. They do not receive price support.
They don't receive that support, but there's 9.9 billion pounds of food that we purchase through our commodity purchasing programs, which includes potatoes. So in a sense, there's also that kind of support. Sometimes there's a tendency to forget the other ways in which we provide assistance for specialty crops. That's one way, not the only way.
I just, when I look at your previous efforts to eliminate the University of Maine's agricultural lab altogether during the Obama administration and restrict the use of potatoes despite the Institute of Medicine study that there was no basis for doing so. I just can't figure out
that wasn't the reason for the WIC decision. This, as we've explained before, it was a situation where we were trying to encourage folks to purchase those items that they would not otherwise purchase with their own resources. It wasn't that we didn't think potatoes were nutritious, obviously, and we've just most recently expanded opportunities for potato exports in Mexico. So it's not that we don't have anything against potatoes.
Well, it feels like it, I can tell you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Agriculture has gotten so complicated. Didn't grow up on a farm, but have lived on one ever since I moved back to my hometown. Fell in love with the forestry side of agriculture. In Indiana, we were probably 90% forested at one time and got, through subsistence farming, cut down to like 5%. It's kind of reforested to the tune of about maybe 35%. And value added, it's equal to, if not exceeds, the value add that you get from row crops. I think that's something that most people don't understand. They see the vast fields of corn and soybeans. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, to keep our forest owners healthy and to make sure that that's as important a part of the equation as the row crop side is. Since that's simple, the trees just grow and get larger, don't involve any inputs, and it's kind of a generational crop. What I hear most about currently is two things. It would be the concentration of ag when it comes to industries across the input spectrum that used to have so many local options, fewer and fewer companies. I think that is something that we got to be aware of. The individual farmer has had to go from small acres to many acres to keep economy of scale in place. Frustrated each year that they've maybe got fewer options. I'd like your comment on, is that side of farming in peril because markets aren't as broad and available as they used to be? We recently discussed it in the Ag Committee on the meat packing industry. Would you want to weigh in on that?
Well, Senator, I think there are two issues here. One you've identified, which is the concentration, and that's absolutely true. We're dealing with fertilizer issues right now. That's a very concentrated industry at this point, the processing industry, and we're trying to address that with some of the work that we're doing at USDA. I think the second issue, and you also alluded to it, is the fact that there is a limited number of ways in which farmers today profit. They grow crops and sell them, or they grow crops and feed it to livestock and sell the products of livestock. What we need to do is be able to create additional ways in which profit centers and income sources can come from the farm. That's why your work, Senator Sabanow's work, and others on the climate smart agriculture effort was important, because it basically creates the platform and the structure for that possibility that climate and climate-related activities could create a revenue stream, an opportunity. The conversion of agricultural waste to chemicals, materials, fabrics, and fibers also creates another new revenue stream that we are in the process of trying to support. So I think the key here is for us to address the concentration issue, but also to address creating multiple income streams on the farm.
I think that's very important. Any business that prospers over time, I can tell you I ran one for 37 years. Whatever you're knocking it out the park with currently is sure to be different 5 to 10 years down the road. And agriculture is a monoculture in terms of really what you have been used to doing. It's got to reflect what you're talking about. The other real concern I hear, which is palpable, was what farmers are going to do in 2023. Let's put the cost aside. That was a big challenge this year. Most ended up getting the inputs they needed to get a crop out. With the current dynamic in place, with our dependency on certain inputs that look like they're in places of peril, do you think farmers will be able to get the inputs for 2023, setting the cost aside? I hear real concern about they just limp through 2022. What are we going to do for 2023?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at is whether or not there's a possibility of taking a look at our storage programs, because there may very well be the capacity to purchase and store, which farmers could potentially utilize to get them through a potentially tough 2023 crop year. Then secondly, obviously, we work on strategies to try to reduce the amount of these inputs. That takes us into precision agriculture. I'll just share with you, there's sensor technology that's being developed at Iowa State University that suggests that 30% of the corn acres in America today, in the Midwest, do not require fertilizer. So if we can accelerate that kind of research and accelerate the capacity of farmers to have that kind of precise information about their farms, we may be able to get them through a process, maybe not 2023, but in the future, where they're not as reliant as they have been on those inputs.
Leveraging technology and finding new markets would be the hallmark of any successful sector of our economy, and never more applicable than in agriculture today. Thank you.
Senator Hoeven, you are now recognized for a second round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Did you already do your second round? I'd want to jump in.
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. All right. Secretary, I'm concerned about the increase in the TRQ for sugar. It's been raised twice now, 170,000 tons, and then more recently. I guess in April it was 220,000 tons, and then more recently another 170,000 tons. That's about 400,000 ton increase. I know that some of this came from production shortfall in Michigan, but that certainly wouldn't be anything near 400,000 tons. So can you address that?
Senator, I want to be able to check our numbers with your numbers, because we're under the assumption it's a little bit less than what you've outlined. But having said that, the key here from our perspective is to maintain a proper balance, and the stocks to ratio has historically been somewhere between 13.5 to 15.5. We got down to 12.5. And what we have been able to do with this additional purchase is to put us within that 13.5 to 15.5 range. And that's where we're comfortable, where we think the program works particularly well, balancing the equities that are involved.
Okay. Well, we're concerned it's going to take you above that range, and so, again, we want to make sure that that those increases do keep it in that range and we're not getting above it. Rural broadband, obviously you've got significant funds in terms of rural broadband, and obviously it's a priority, and I think a bipartisan priority. So, where are you at with getting those dollars out? What's your plan to do it?
We made so there are two pots of money. The first pot came from American Rescue Plan, pandemic assistance programs, and so forth. That pot has gone through several rounds. We most recently completed a round. We received 305 applications for roughly $1.15 billion. Those applications, I think, were in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 times that amount. So obviously great interest. We also received the bipartisan infrastructure resources of $1.9 billion. We're now taking a look and analyzing the applications, the 305 applications, Senator, to determine whether or not there's a possibility of accelerating and utilizing some of the built money in that third round, because essentially they would potentially qualify for the same requirements that would allow us to put several $1 billion into awards to get action this year. And then the balance of whatever is left from the infrastructure law, we would announce availability sometime later this year for awards, probably the early part of 23.
Being around 4. Or would that be
3.5?
You just keep going. In other words,
Right.
You're going to continue on.
Yes.
Okay. And so when do you anticipate funding announcements then for round 3?
This summer.
This summer.
We're going to complete the. We would be able to make these announcements sooner, but we want to see whether or not there's a way of accelerating the build money into this round, and that requires us to analyze where these applications are, how many of them would in fact qualify, and it's going to take some time. We think by the latter part of this month we'll have a better understanding of how much of that bill money could actually be incorporated in this round, okay. And then that will be the set of announcements this summer.
All right. On the child nutrition waivers, what steps are you taking as we get back to the traditional program to be ready for next year? What are you doing?
Let me tell you something, Senator. This is going to be chaotic. Just make no mistake about it. The failure to have these waivers is going to create a lot of chaos in schools across the United States. Now, there is very limited things we can do. We don't have the flexibility to provide waivers to the extent that we've provided them. We can very, very limited. We can't increase the reimbursement rate. We can't expand universal free school meals. So we will focus on community eligibility. We'll focus on the limited waivers that we have. We'll take a look at any additional capacity we have with resources in terms of commodity purchases. But schools are going to have a very difficult time. Make no mistake about it.
So, Madam Chair, I have a couple questions left that I do want to ask, but I'm happy to defer if you want to. Then I'd like another shot at it. But
Well, we can give you a special third round.
Fantastic.
Senator Hyde Smith.
Mr. Secretary, in recent years, this subcommittee has made just historic investments in developing methods to better understand and detect and respond to chronic wasting disease. And, an incurable, always fatal disease affecting the white-tailed deer and other members of the deer family. Historically, there have been many questions and unknowns about the disease, but thanks to the new CWD research being conducted by USDA and its university partners, along with the better surveillance and response efforts carried out by the state's wildlife agencies, we're starting to make great strides in CWD. And hunting and outdoor recreation contributes billions to the American economy, more than $2.7 billion in annual economic output in Mississippi alone. Would you agree that our investments in CWD are paying off, that we are seeing a positive return on our investments, and would you agree that we need to continue investing and activities related to chronic waste disease in fiscal year 2023 and beyond that?
I think I would answer that yes, yes, and yes. I think you asked 3 questions. Yes, we've got 35 herds. There's no vaccine or cure yet. It's in 25 states. There's a need for more and additional resources. Those resources will allow us to do more surveillance, more testing, more management, and hopefully more responsive activities. So clearly, we need additional resources.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Senator Hoven.
I want to commend Senator Hyde Smith just in general, but here specifically for setting up my question, which is we have legislation to do more with chronic wasting disease. It's a bipartisan. Martin Heinrich is lead on the majority side, but we've got others on both sides of the House. So clearly you would, based on your last comments, support that legislation, which would provide more funding for research relative to chronic wasting disease because it affects both domestic and wild animals.
Yes.
Okay, great. FSIS overtime. We've got food safety and inspection challenges, I guess. I mean, we have workforce challenges everywhere, right? But with our inspectors in FSIS, we have some challenges, and so we included some provisions that give you more flexibility. So where are we at with implementing that?
It's implemented, Senator. The problem is it's a 1-year. You've got to do it every year.
Right.
But it does give us a tremendous amount of flexibility, and it makes it a little bit easier, reduces the stress. Workers still have the option of working those overtime hours, but if for whatever reason they're just spent, this gives us the ability to continue to keep the plant open, but have the flexibility to have the inspectors on staff who want to be there.
Which is something you need right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question relates to is also a workforce question, and that is getting the H-2A eligible people through the process and on the job. And there's 2 aspects to it. One, for some of the Ukrainians that are coming, you know, Ukraine is so similar to us in terms of their ag base. Matter of fact, some of their livestock and so forth come from my state, where we've actually, some of our producers have flown breeding stock over on 747s, if you can believe that. And you maybe have seen some of that.
Well,
it's unbelievable.
Iowa started that a long time ago.
Yeah, I figured you'd probably been involved with it too. It's really impressive.
We did it in Japan when they had a typhoon back in the 1960s.
Yeah, but you'd think they'd go by boat, but they actually put them on these huge aircraft. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mean when pigs fly, right? How crazy
they
is
did.
that? You
They
probably said that a
literally
few
did.
times as governor. But you didn't mean it literally necessarily. But it's both processing these H-2A applications, which we need to get these folks who are eligible through the system. And in a lot of cases, they're folks that have come before. And you know the need out there for workers in the ag area. So utilizing some of these Ukrainians that are coming here, expediting their ability to get those work permits would be good for them, good for us. That's one aspect of the question. Then the other is in terms of some flexibility in the work, in that they can be out there and do field work and that kind of stuff, or on-farm work, but then we also need folks in the processing plants. And their visa doesn't necessarily allow them to do both, but it's really very, you know, it's just a continuation of pretty much the same thing, and it has some of the seasonality to it. So is there a way we can maybe do both of these things to kind of help with the labor issue?
You know, I'll make you a deal, Senator.
Sure. Well, maybe.
I'll help you with this problem if you can get your colleagues to vote on the Ag Workforce Modernization Act and actually get this thing solved in a permanent way. This is nuts. This is just crazy what's going on here with this workforce. We're sort of nickel and dime it. We're putting a Band-Aid on it. We're constantly talking about H-2A when we all know that fundamentally we got to fix the immigration system, and the ag community and the labor community has come and said, here's the fix that we would like to see in our part of the industry, and it passes the House in a bipartisan way. I just don't understand why it can't pass this body.
Well, it gets pulled into everything else. You know that.
But
in
why?
the meantime, though,
why does it get pulled into everything else?
Well, you know how that process works here. But in the meantime, are these some things we can do?
In the meantime, we'll continue to look for ways in which we can try to alleviate the stress, but it is a temporary fix. It's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to relieve the underlying lack of confidence that farmers now feel. They just don't know if they're ever going to have the workforce, and they're scared about this. They're really concerned about it.
Well, and that's where the merit-based aspect comes in. That's very important. But again, our guys are concerned about getting these folks through the system. People who are eligible now, and so we need your help on it.
I'm happy to help.
Good.
And I would hope that you would help me get 59 other senators to vote for the Ag Worker Modernization Act.
Thanks for your work on all these things, Secretary. We've had opportunity to work together as governors 8 years during the Obama administration, and so I do appreciate your help on these things. Thanks, and thank you for being here today, and to your crew too. People like Zach Douche, you got a lot of folks out there working really hard for our farmers and ranchers, and so I want to express my appreciation for that.
Thank you, Senator.
And Mr. Secretary, I want to add my words of thank you to both you and Mr. Rapp for being here today. I think we had a good discussion, and I look forward to continuing to work with you as we begin this appropriation process for fiscal year 23. Questions for the record are due by next Tuesday, May 17th, and we would appreciate responses from the USDA within 30 days. And with that,
Madam Chair,
yes,
may I
you
say
may.
just one thing? Because Senator Hoeven was not here, I don't think, when I gave my opening comments, and maybe he got in at the tail end. Senator, I just want to leave with you the same statistic that I left with the rest of the committee members. 61,670 farm families are currently on the brink. These are people that have borrowed money from USDA that are either delinquent, bankrupt, or pending foreclosure. And it's an issue that we have got to address. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.